Hey, hi, folks. I thought that since I'm recovering from the accident here and not able really to type very well, that I would experiment with trying to put some random thoughts occasionally down in a video and posting them to the site, especially to complement the presentations in class and to get to some points perhaps that we didn't have a chance to talk about before. And one thing I'd like to mention today really is left over from our discussions of Genesis chapters 2 and 3 that we're going to be moving on from. But there was one thing that I had wanted to talk about in class and didn't get around to it. And I think that it's a pretty significant issue in terms of contemporary conversations related to gender inequality. And that has to do with how one reads the biblical text, especially Genesis 2 and 3, in the light of the question of Genesis chapter 3, verses 15 and following. And this is what is often referred to in Genesis 3:15 as 14 and 15 as the proto-evangelium, or the very primal gospel, as it were. Unfortunately, a little named that way. I don't know that we had much to talk about, or time to talk about that, but I wanted to talk especially then about the curse of the land and the cursing of the relationship between the man and the woman that is implied in Genesis chapter 3, verses 16 and 17 following. The critical verses are those words in verse 16. To the woman, God said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Now, obviously, this has been taken, especially in Christian conversation, but even also in Jewish and Muslim biblical interpretation too, as words, a saying that can often be slanted to unfortunate sexist and even misogynist tendencies. And we know that the New Testament itself was not averse to that, and certainly early Jewish tradition wasn't, blaming woman for what transpired in the garden and understanding gender equality to have been one of the results of that. Raises two questions. First of all is the distinction that I would like to raise. May have talked about this before, but want to make sure you've heard it. The distinction between what I would call a prescriptive reading of the biblical texts and a descriptive reading of the biblical texts. It's very easy, and most of us probably have been trained in this from children upwards, of reading these texts as though they are prescriptive texts, and they prescribe how the human condition is to turn out, so that these stories happen, and the results of the stories then lead to the way that we experience life. First comes the story, and then comes the human reality, and the story prescribes human reality. This is the way that we would naturally tend to read the stories, especially in more conservative biblical traditions. And it is easy then to read these stories prescriptively, as though human gender equality is a prescribed condition which we are simply to accept and understand, if not glorify, at least to accept and understand it as such. That the story prescribes for us the human condition. I would like to suggest, however, that these, as well as most biblical stories, ought to be read rather descriptive of the human condition. And that is to say that first comes the human condition and the struggle to understand the human condition, and then the stories flow out of that in an attempt for humans to describe the human condition that they are experiencing. So first comes the condition of experiencing life in a culture that is considerably dominated by male order, male rule, And the stories then develop out of that in order to describe, that they're certainly not trying to prescribe the way things were meant to be by God, but they're trying to describe how it is that we experience life. So I hope that you might reflect upon the distinctions between a descriptive and a prescriptive reading of the biblical texts. And I certainly want to make the case for reading these texts along with other biblical texts in a sense as descriptive of the human condition. First comes the human condition, and then comes the story in order to try and explain it. Now, even more importantly, however, I want to talk to you about the nature of the language used in verse 16 when God addresses the woman, saying, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Now, these words have long been taken, of course, as sort of some sort of a clarion call, at least to understand the innate misogyny of the human condition, and to blame, in a sense, the scene in the garden for that extreme gender equality that we experience. But I would like to raise an issue that comes out of these very verses themselves and relate what it is said about this gender equality to what it goes on to say in verse 17 when God then turns to Adam and when in the subsequent verses, when God turns to Adam in verse 17 and says, Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. Now, verses 17 and 18, also read descriptively, intend to give some sort of an explanation as to the fact that we encounter weediness in our toil and our labor. And this is not used to endorse weeds or for us simply to somehow roll over and accept them. It is, in fact, an acknowledgement that we do have weeds in our gardens, in our lives, in our days of labor. But we are called then to do something about those weeds. We don't simply endorse weeds. We certainly do not simply accept weeds. What have humans traditionally done without much thought and complaint about it is that we have gone about trying to find ways to mitigate life's weediness. Now, some of the solutions that we've come up with have not been just singularly helpful. We certainly know that some herbicides are problematic, but the fact is that part of our human condition leads us to struggle against the weediness of our land, of our lives, and we take the curse here of the ground in the sense of a challenge for us to do something about in order to mitigate it. So I would like to apply that same reasoning to the words that are spoken to the woman when God says that her longing shall be for her husband, but her husband shall rule over her, this gender inequality. I would like to suggest that this is like the weediness of our lives, and we are not simply called on to accept it, and certainly not to enshrine it as some sort of God-given reality. But we are called upon to rise up and to resist it and to do something to try and mitigate the consequences of that perceived misogyny and gender inequality. In fact, that sort of thing is also indicated in the words that God speaks to the woman herself. Your pain, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. That these words are not meant to simply be a call for us to easily accept the gender inequality of life. That these words are a challenge for us to resist that gender inequality, and as though they were weeds in our garden, to give them the same sort of intentional resistance that we do when we encounter crabgrass and all sorts of other things growing in our gardens and our lawns. To resist this weediness of gender inequality and to develop strategies to try and combat it. Knowing that some of those strategies may bring with them their own unintended consequences, but to keep being willing to go back to the drawing board in order to try and figure out strategies to defeat the consequences of that gender inequality. So just food for thought, folks, and I hope that you're able to think about these issues, maybe giving an adult education class sometime down the road in a parish or two. And I look forward to seeing you on Monday morning. Take care. Bye-bye.